In the world of public policy, there doesn't seem to be a lot of agreement. But one thing that's almost universally accepted is the notion that we live in a time of increasing complexity. Coming up, a discussion with one of the leading thinkers on complexity science and its implications for solving the world's most challenging problems. This week on Dialogue, Chaos, Complexity, and Public Policy. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest today is Irene Sanders, Executive Director and founder of the Washington Center for Complexity and Public Policy. Irene is also the author of this book, Strategic Thinking and the New Science, Planning in the Midst of Chaos, Complexity, and Change. Welcome to Dialogue, and thanks for joining us, Irene.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
You know, this may say more about me than it says about the subject matter, but I think that when I can think of the time where chaos theory and complexity theory became part of the popular culture, it was around the time Michael Crichton was writing Jurassic Park and the movie was made. That seemed to put it on everyone's radar screen in a way that it wasn't before. But the science is much older than that, correct?
Well, the beginnings of the science go way back, but I would say that the really coalescing of what is chaos theory and what is complexity began in the late 1950s, early 60s with the discovery of what we really now call chaos theory, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But the real coming together of complexity and the sciences of complexity began in 1984 with the founding of the Santa Fe Institute. And you're right, Michael Crichton's book, Jurassic Park, was the first time that most people had ever heard the term chaos theory, and he made it easy to understand and remember. Now,
there's a distinction between chaos theory and complexity theory.
Yeah.
Could you describe that?
Yeah, I think that, let me begin for a second with what is a complex system?
Yes, please.
Okay. A complex system is a system with many interacting and interdependent components. Traffic, the weather, the United Nations, the stock market are all good examples of a complex system. Complexity is a characteristic that arises, or a quality that arises in that type of system where the components are interacting interdependently and in unpredictable ways. You get great complexity. You get a lot of interconnection, and a lot of surprising things can happen in a system like that. Chaos theory really came out of the search for better weather models. In the late 1950s, early 60s, Edward Lorenz did a famous experiment when he was trying to make a better weather prediction model, and he had a very primitive computer, and every simulation he ran was the same, you know, sun, rain outside on his computer, no matter what it said outside the window. Mm-hmm. And what he discovered through his research on weather was really the foundation of what we call chaos theory, and it is that systems that have a predictable, like an orbit or a cycle, can also have periods of instability that we call a sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which means something can happen, creates a little chaotic episode, and then it goes back into its regular cycle or whatever the end state is. That's known metaphorically as the butterfly effect, and that's what Crichton did so well, talking about taking the dinosaur DNA, doing something very small and having it propagate through the system and ultimately become a dinosaur ready to eat you for dinner.
Right. But then the dinosaurs weren't supposed to be able to reproduce.
And they did.
But they do, because it wasn't linear.
Right. It was a nonlinear system, and that's the other thing that really chaos complexity came together and took off in the late 1970s, early 80s, when computer technology went through a lot of changes and made it possible to do multiple calculations and iterations very quickly. And computer graphics also allowed scientists to see their experiments unfold and to use their intuition in a way that they never had. So the computer technology really provided a tool of insight, much like the microscope did to biologists or the telescope for astronomers. And it allowed them to ask questions that prior to that they knew they needed to be looking at, but they didn't have the technology or the type of mathematics that could handle a system with many interacting components.
Life has always been complicated, but we all agree with this notion. I used it in my opening text to our viewers, that we're living in increasingly complex times. Can you flesh that out for us a bit? Why are these more complex time? Is it the rate of advancement of technology? Why do we consider this more complex than, say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago?
Well, it's interesting because one of the technological advances that really made it possible for us to communicate worldwide almost instantaneously also created greater complexity, because information was being fed into systems and people were able to use current information and develop policy to respond to it and make market decisions. So the technology has increased complexity, but the rate of change has just increased exponentially. And you see that what goes on in Beijing and Washington instantly is heard around the world and affects other governments and other decisions.
So the speed matters, is what you're saying.
Speed really matters, yeah.
Because no reflection time. No time
right,
to,
very
you
little
just
time to reflect. Yeah.
React. Here's something Representative Chris Shays said about your work. We're talking about your work, and this is something he said: the study of old causes no longer yields a clear picture of future effects. Seems to challenge this notion that past is prologue, and that really to understand where we're headed, you need to know where we've been. Has that been turned on its head?
Yeah,
is history less relevant?
It's not less relevant, but I think what we've learned is it's not the only piece of information that we need to look at. Most of my work is around strategic thinking. How do you do better for strategic thinking no matter what issue you're looking at? And strategic thinking really has three major components: hindsight about the past, insight about the present, and foresight about the future. Hindsight we do pretty well, but unfortunately a lot of policy is still developed only based on what we know about the past. Complexity has allowed us to develop better foresight and to see what's beginning to take shape, because it helps us ask better questions. And I distinguish between foresight and forecasting. Many of the futurists and trends modelers still use linear forecasting models based on linear extrapolation and trends analysis.
So you look at the history, you look at the current data, and you stretch it out over 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Right, exactly. And we know from chaos theory that little things can happen that can greatly change the course of some of those events. And unfortunately, a lot of our policy is still being developed using that sort of linear cause-effect thinking, rather than saying we live in a world, we now have a way to understand complex systems and complex issues. We finally have some real undergirding science that supports a lot of our social science applications. And I would say that the social sciences are still struggling, and they're working to incorporate it, but the policy arm of that is really struggling to figure out how to incorporate this into their thinking.
Another term I see in your work, in your writings, is early warning capabilities.
Yeah.
I'm guessing in this case, it's not a situation where you're going to make a very distinct prediction of an outcome, but you're going to look at some signs and send up some flares of things that people should look for?
Yeah, and what I do is I help. I've worked with a lot of analysts in the intelligence community and corporations who are also looking at foresight for whatever their company is doing. And one of the things that complexity does is it really presents a framework for thinking about the future. And this is a good example. In South Africa in 1994, when the ANC won and apartheid was washed aside, that was something that the CIA did not see coming, and they'll tell that's one of their favorite stories, because they only listened to the elite. They only listened to what the leaders were saying. And from complexity, we know that things emerge and bubble up from the ground level throughout the system. So they weren't paying attention to what was going on in the streets and in the neighborhoods.
So if you just talk to network executives, you weren't going to hear about YouTube. Something like that. There are these things that happen on this now viral level.
Right, and look what happened in Iran with following the elections, with all of the videos coming out. So there are many examples of how countries have changed that were once isolated because their young people have access to a lot more technology and they're in communication. So to answer your question, yes, a lot of things have changed in our way of looking at a system is much richer now because we can ask better questions. Complexity can tell us what to look at, how a system is likely to change, and where to put our attention.
You know, when you describe that, it's a little bit scary, and when you think about that, still the major way that we conduct business among nations is presidents or premiers or prime ministers have summits or ambassadors meet together. It's all top down. And are there anything close to enough things happening at that grassroots level that you think needs to be monitored as well?
Well, I think that obviously in developing policy, it's important to have people at all levels talking to each other. But when we're looking at national security issues and we're trying to develop better warning, see things before they happen, then it's important to really look at what's going on at the ground level and in a much larger context. You know, one of the frustrating things is that in policy we tend to do, if we just do this, then the whole system will straighten out like a train track, you know. And the truth is, in a complex situation or working on an issue like Afghanistan or healthcare or the economy, there are multiple points of influence in a complex system. And because it has that tendency to propagate, changes can propagate and become a big thing in the future, it's important to probe the system before you develop a policy that's going to be in place for the next 30 or 40 years. So I think that it changes our whole way of, to me, it broadens it and it deepens it. It's a very rich way of thinking about systems. But to a lot of people, it's very threatening. And I always say to the groups,
because it's less controllable.
Yeah, but I always say to the groups that I work with, we're all learning to think this way. You know, none of us have lived in the kind of world we live in today, and none of us have been to the future. So we're all exploring, and we have new tools now of exploration.
Our guest next week has invented a time machine, actually, has been to the future. No, that's not true. But this, you know, this whole notion of complex systems, are they by definition more vulnerable than simple systems? You know, anecdotally, I think of you're in a supermarket and the computer system goes down and they can't ring you up. You know, there's no manual cash registers. Or airlines, there's an example, the hub system and the air traffic control system. So a couple of flight delays start to pile up in Chicago and it spreads around the world. Is this the case for complex systems? Are they by definition more vulnerable to disruption?
Well, the airline system is a good example of a complex system. And one of the things we know is that most complex systems are networks of some sort. There's some network structure, whether it's a biological system, the human blood system, or whether it's the airline system. The type of network may look different, but they're hubs and nodes and there are ways information flows around. One of the insights from study of networks is that it's important to know where the hubs and the nodes are, especially like in the airline industry, because you're exactly right. If Chicago went down, it messes up air traffic all over the country, whereas if Cincinnati or Nashville went down, it's not going to be so disruptive. So you have to know that the interconnections can create, the interdependencies can create vulnerability, but you also have to know when there's a problem, how do you disconnect? We saw that in our recent economic situation. We couldn't disconnect. Countries tried to disconnect, but we saw how globally connected we were. But we also saw a couple years ago with the cascading electrical failure of the eastern grid that there were operators in Pennsylvania who were able to cut off the flow so that our area, the Mid-Atlantic and Washington, were not affected. So they separated us from the system. So that's one of the insights. When you understand the structure of a complex system and how it's likely to behave, then you understand how to work with it in a mechanical system or a combination of human mechanical systems.
I want to ask you a bit about how you got into this line of work. I know that you worked on Congress. You worked on the staff of Senator Sam Nunn. Is that correct? There's a joke that's begging to be said here about learn a lot about chaos and complexity working on the Hill.
That's true.
but how did you get into this particular field?
When I was on Senator Nunn's staff, one of the things that was always interesting to me is how overnight things happened that we didn't anticipate that would really disrupt our plans for legislation, our coalitions. You know, things had to be redone. And so change happened and we didn't see it coming. And everybody who's worked in corporate America has heard that over and over. So when I left the Hill, ultimately I started a consulting business, and what I was interested in is doing better strategic planning, but I realized that the strategic thinking was the piece that had to come first. And so I apprenticed myself to a firm in Michigan. I went back and did a fellowship on change. I started hanging out with futurists to see how they looked at this. And Actually, it was in 1989. I was getting ready to fly to Los Angeles, and a friend of mine handed me James Gleick's book, Chaos Making a New Science, and said, read this. And I read it on that flight, the whole flight, and tried to use some of it when I got to the other end. But I knew instantly that I'd found what I thought was needed, which was the science of change. It talked about how things were changing and what scientists were learning about changes and evolution in all types of systems.
Now, the clients that you work for, I see on the list the Central Intelligence Agency, the NYPD Counterterrorism Bureau, U.S. Army War College. Can you give us some insight into where are the pockets of activity as it relates to complexity science? Who are the leaders? What industries? What disciplines? Are there places that are ahead of the curve in applying this kind of thinking?
Well, first of all, every discipline is pretty much involved, especially starting with math and physics and chemistry and the biological sciences, moving into the social sciences. Mm-hmm. I do think the social sciences are the last to really work with applying the insights, because there's always been this divide between the physical sciences and the social sciences. But obviously the systems we're concerned with national security and domestic issues are social systems. And it's very easy to see them as complex systems.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out, who's really embracing this? Who is saying this is how we have to start viewing the world to get a better outcome?
Every university practically in the world has one or more research centers working on some aspect of chaos and complexity. There are a number of independent centers like mine. There are several others focused on healthcare. There's the Santa Fe Institute. There's some industries that have used aspects of chaos or complexity to look at delivery systems. NASA has used pieces of it to correct shuttle orbits. The intelligence community has been interested, and there are a lot of people in the Washington area who hear about it. But I would say that the typical, Washington moves very fast. A lot of decisions are based on opinion instead of good analysis. Mm-hmm. The intelligence community typically breaks down answers small questions of a much larger question, small pieces of a bigger question. And one of the things that complexity tells us, which is what we've been working, those of us who are working in this area, is that we need to step back and look at the whole system. We need to do our synthesis first before you do the analysis. President Obama, I think, is a really good example of a strategic thinker who does his synthesis. He stands back, he looks at the big picture, he takes multiple perspectives, asks questions and says, now these are the questions I want to ask. This is the analysis that I'd like to see. So that's a really good example of someone, I think, who intuitively and probably from his own reading, he really does understand a good bit about complexity.
It's almost the metaphor of the forest from the trees, not
yeah.
Is that what you're describing?
Yeah.
Complexity thinkers look at the big picture, the forest.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, we usually when I'm talking to a group, I say, stand back. I put maps. I give everybody maps to draw on. Uh-huh. And recently I finished a seminar for the intelligence community, and there was a young analyst in there. He said, if I'm working on Cambodia, I'm not actually even encouraged or allowed to speak to someone working on Burma/Myanmar. And to me, that was just astonishing, because whether you're looking at cybersecurity or terrorism or what's going on in one part of the world, it's really a worldwide system, partly because of telecommunications, policies interacting, finances interacting. So to see that people are limited in how they're able to study it.
Is that just bad management? I mean, why would they, globalization isn't a new concept, and you have people working on different countries and never interacting. Doesn't seem to make any sense on any level.
I agree. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but it happens a lot.
Yeah.
I've had people from, instructors from the War College and from different universities say, who are working with intelligence and military, it's very hard for us to be allowed to speak to people from other parts of the world, and yet it makes so much sense. To the rest of us, it's like, this is the way things need to be done. You have to stand back and look and see how things are interconnected.
You mentioned how quickly things happen in this town, and then there's also the politics, and you also mentioned that in that arena, you might not necessarily be supporting science. It's what you want to believe versus what the data indicates. Talk to us about your work in this context, because you've seen things like Chris Mooney's book, The War on Science, and this whole culture of denying facts and creating their own reality. There was the famous interview Ron Brownstein did with an official in the Bush administration who went unnamed. Rumors have said Karl Rove, but it's never been confirmed. But that we don't we create our own reality. That's the nature of superpower. And there's sort of this arrogance that we can control reality. We don't have to take into account the things you're talking about because we'll just change it.
Right.
Is that something that you encounter? Is that something that makes it difficult to get people to adopt the type of strategic planning that you're promoting?
Yeah, I think we encounter it because we all want to believe that. I'd like to believe that too. I'd like to believe that we can control things. But we can't. The evidence is clear that we can't. And the science is clear. I mean, every week, think about all the new discoveries in astronomy and anthropology and biology. You know, this theory was disproven last week, this one this week. It's really, that to me is very exciting. You know, it's a continuous exploration. But I do run into that. And that I try not to run into that. I try to avoid those type of people because it's very difficult to break through that.
They're probably not the kind of people who are hiring you.
Right.
Either.
And I think most people who would hire, first of all, let me say that our center serves as a bridge between the research and the applications. And our particular application has been very focused on strategic thinking and foresight development. And whether that's policy, intelligence analysis, strategic thinking, or corporate futures research. Foresight is the piece that everybody really struggles with, so that's where we've been focused. What I frequently will do is, depending on who the audience is and the level of sophistication or how far we're into a project, I'll have one of the scientists come in and talk to them to answer certain questions. So we're clear that what we do is an introduction, get people excited, bring in other people to work with us, because we believe we operate like a network, we believe in that network, and those of us who are in the field are really pretty stay networked with each other.
Yeah, we're short on time, believe it or not. Time is flying by, so I don't want to prescribe a current situation to you. I'd give you sort of the list, whether we're talking about nuclear proliferation or the so-called war on terror. I know we don't call it that as much anymore. You know, the healthcare dilemma, the global economy. If you would just pick and choose and give us some examples of how complexity theory, chaos and complexity theory relates to these issues that the world is trying to sort through.
Okay, one really good example is cybersecurity. We're hearing a lot about cyber attacks, and we're all probably victims of it. Most people involved in cybersecurity still think of hardware and software. It's a patching problem. You know, if we just come up with a software patch for the invasion, then we've taken care of it. And I say, no, we need to step back and look.
That's a straight line.
That's a straight line. They see it as a mechanical system rather than a dynamic system. And cybersecurity is really a worldwide evolving system where you've got terrorists and hackers, you've got the protocols changing, you've got the hardware and software changing. There's a whole constellation of things you need to consider if you're working on cybersecurity and trying to secure our systems. And that's one of the places complexity can really help us. It's what to pay attention to, how to look at that bigger system. The economy is certainly one, and you know.
Should we have seen this coming?
Yes. Yeah, we should have seen it coming. Back in 2003, Alan Greenspan said at his Jackson Hole meeting of central bankers that that they were hardly able to keep track of the complexity in the economic system. They knew the models were linear, and they also knew that they could not provide an approximation of what would happen with an idiosyncratic shock. So he
essentially was saying, we know how vulnerable we are.
Right.
Was he suggesting we also know what to do about it?
No,
apparently not.
But at that time, we were doing a project with the Federal Reserve. We had an art exhibit there right outside of his office, and I was thrilled to hear him say this. But not much happened, because the standard way of thinking about the economy was that there were rational decisions, you know, things could be controlled with policy, that it wasn't as interconnected. In 2007, Ben Bernanke, current Fed chairman, at his speech at Jackson Hole said we need to be looking at the whole system and not just bank by bank. Well, one bank can't tell you about the system. And so when I read that, it's still a little surprising to me, given how much we've known about systems and how every corporation or every organization is talking about systems thinking and system change, that so many of our federal bureaucracies and the type of thinking there has not really caught up with the science that's available.
If you were consulting someone on a big problem like, say, nuclear proliferation, which this seems to be the ultimate in chaotic possibilities, how would you counsel them? Where do you start to sort through that? What are the things they should be looking at that are in this area of the nonlinear?
Well, Senator Nunn's a good example because that's his main issue. He really cares about that. But obviously, I think they need to be standing back and looking at worldwide. What have we got? Unsecured nuclear facilities. We've got North Korea and Iran walking right up to the door to a nuclear weapon, and how are we going to stop them? We've got, Pakistan, India, others have already got nuclear weapons. What are we going to do about? What are we going to do about that? There are multiple things that need to be done, kind of like the Big Bang. You don't just do one thing. Multiple courses of action need to be taken simultaneously. Many coalitions need to be built. Obviously, the rogue players, the rogue actors are the ones that we're most concerned about.
I guess this is a personal question more than it is sort of an expert question, but I'm just wondering, somebody who views the world through the lens that you see things in. I'm sure you watch a news story, say about shortages of flu vaccine or something like that, something that was in the news cycle this week, and you must start to think about it in terms of complexity and what maybe that they got wrong when they made the initial announcement that they're backtracking on. With that in mind, when you view the world as you do, does it make you more optimistic or more pessimistic?
I think generally I'm optimistic, but I get very frustrated when I listen to the news because it tends to be the short pieces, the narrow view, the local view, rather than H1N1 is a good example of a lot of things that they missed in information. Children who are taken when they have a network full of sexual predators, that are registered in their area. So I get very frustrated because we hear the news media use the words chaos and complexity almost daily, but they don't ever stop to think that what the words really mean or how the new science might help them provide a deeper understanding of issues. But ultimately, I'm an optimist, and one of the best examples, I think that knowing small things can make a big difference. Or one person can make a difference. And regardless of what you think about President Obama having received the Nobel Prize, what I think is really interesting about that is how one person inspired so much hope in the world and really changed in a very short period of time the way people were viewing us, given the past years with the war in Iraq and a lot of the problems that we've had with public opinion worldwide.
So I guess now the challenge is follow up the change in tone with change in action.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Irene, thanks for joining us. Yeah. Really appreciate it. Fascinating field that you work in. And to our viewers, I want to tell you, unfortunately, we are out of time, but we appreciate your comments and you encourage you to share them with us. And you can do so by sending us email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until then and until next week, for all of us at the Wilson Center and Dialogue, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue can be seen on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, please visit www.worldview.org.